Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. So I found this topic kind of by accident. I was looking to see how many lives maybe had been lost in 1819, and then came across this. 19, did I say 1818? 1918. They only have 68 slides. How about that? I think that's the least number I've had. So I won't have to talk quite as fast. 1899 MHS graduate loses life on the Cyclops. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this story at all, the Cyclops. No one? Okay. Frank Nigg was a lieutenant aboard the U.S.S. Cyclops when it disappeared on March 4, 1918. The ship carrying 306 people, included enlisted men and passengers, was never heard from again. It is one of the Bermuda Triangle's great mysteries. Although the ship disappeared on March 4, 1918, the designated date of death for everyone on board was June 14, 1918. Local newspaper account. Lieutenant Nigg, missing on Cyclops, is a former Iowa boy. He lived at Macokota, and his mother, Mrs. Conrad Nigg, is now living in Davenport with her daughter, Mrs. H.A. Young. He is about 40 and has been in the Navy 16 years. He was born in Macokota and lived there most of his life until he went on the high seas. The Cyclops' role expanded beyond mere logistics as it was drawn into significant military and diplomatic events. One of the early highlights of its service was its participation in the U.S. efforts related to the laying of the transatlantic communications cable. This operation was critical for improving long-distance communication between North America and Europe, enhancing diplomatic and military coordination during a period marked by growing international tensions and the onset of World War I. Named after the Cyclops, a race of giants from Greek mythology, she was the second U.S. naval vessel to bear the name. As the loss occurred during World War I, she was thought to have been captured or sunk by a German raider or submarine. And long before the collier was reported missing, an advertisement appeared in a Portuguese newspaper announcing that a requiem mass would be celebrated for Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, lost when the Cyclops was sunk at sea. It was suspected that it was inserted by German agents as a means of transmitting a report of their operations. The U.S.S. Cyclops was initially assigned to the Navy Auxiliary Service, NAS, a component of the Navy Department's Bureau of Navigation from November 8, 1910 until May 1, 1917, when she was commissioned as the United States prepared for war. The NAS operated transports, supply vessels, fuel ships, and other vessels as may be assigned to it by the Navy Department. Shown are the blueprints. The Cyclops was one of the largest fuel ships afloat. The vessel was authorized by Congress in 1908 and launched May 7, 1910. Her dimensions were 542 feet overall length, 65 feet breadth, 36 feet 9 inches depth of hull, and her net Suez Canal tonnage was 7,055 tons. The vessel cost $923,000 to build. The U.S.S. Cyclops was built in Philadelphia. The ship was a Proteus collier and could carry 12,500 tons of coal while making 15 knots with her twin screws. When the United States declared war on Germany and its allies in April 1917, support ships such as the Cyclops fell under the command of the Navy. The administrative change greatly affected the crew of these support ships. Instead of being run by civilians, the officers were now members of the Naval Reserve Force. The Cyclops' final mission was to transport 9,960 tons of coal from her home port in Norfolk, Virginia to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and bring back 11,000 tons of manganese ore. She departed on January 9, 1918, and arrived in Rio on January 28, where she stayed for 2 weeks, unloading and loading cargo. On February 15th, 309 souls departed for Bahia, Brazil, the only scheduled stop before Baltimore, Maryland. 2 days later, at 1800 hours, on February 22nd, the ship embarked for Maryland. She was expected to arrive on March 13th. The last known location of the Cyclops was an unplanned stop made at Barbados on March 3rd. With 1,800 nautical miles to go on a 4,844 nautical mile journey. Duty on board colliers was far from attractive. Fuel ships such as the Cyclops did not appear on recruiting posters. The coal handling equipment and other machinery was enormous and very dangerous to operate. Coal dust was everywhere. There was no rest for the weary, as electric lighting ensured that operations took place 24 hours a day. There were some veteran officers and enlisted men, but many of the sailors newly assigned to the crew had never set foot on a ship prior to their wartime enlistment. They came from all walks of life, young and old, from big cities and from RFDs. They were professionals, high school dropouts, tradesmen, salesmen, a physician, mechanics, and more. These Navy men answered their country's call and served aboard the Cyclops. Frank Carl Nigg, an 1899 graduate of Maquoketa High School, was aboard the Cyclops as a passenger. The U.S.S. Cyclops, shown anchored in the Hudson River, probably during the 1911 Naval Review in New York City. Photo, U.S. Library of Congress. Parents of Frank Carl Nigg were Private William Conrad Nigg and Henrietta Kuhn Nigg. Frank's father, William, was born in France in 1834. He served in the French military from March 31st, 1855 through December 31st, 1869. He was in Africa for 6 years, serving in the 1st and 2nd Squadron. He was in Mexico for 3 years, for which his 3rd Squadron received the Medal of Mexico, was with the French force under Napoleon, later Maximilian. From 1869 to 1870, he entered the 4th Regiment of Mounted Soldiers of the 2nd Squadron. According to a letter written by his daughter in 1967, William was previously married while living in France to Marie Heights, and to this union, 6 children were born. In 1873, William arrived in America, and a year later was married to Henrietta Kuhn, a native of Hanover, Germany. Children born to this union are listed on the slide. William was naturalized February 27, 1890. The original spelling of Nigg was N-I-G-U-E-S. In 1971, Grace Houlihan, then JCHS curator, wrote to a Nigg relative. The Niggs were industrious and worked hard in their truck garden. I can still see Mrs. Nigg with her little express wagon full of vegetables. Charlie quite often visited our family, but I was younger and not interested in family history at that time. Conrad was a big man, and the neighbors wondered how the family managed since he was never known to work. But the father, think about this, the father was 67 when his last child graduated high school. Census shows he was a gardener even at age 75. And I think those neighbors probably weren't aware of all the hard years that he had in the military. This photo was found at this museum of the Nigg family. It doesn't really show up very well, I guess. And I can't identify who was who. The names were not listed. First firstborn son, Louis, married Hattie Kelchner in 1897. Hattie was the daughter of George Kelchner and Hannah Penrose Kelchner. To this union, 2 children were born, Harry Elwood Nigg and Thelma H. Nigg Camps. Louis, a tinsman, died in Solon at the age of 95. Second-born son Charles is shown in this newspaper article when he left Maquoketa, November 19, 1912. Headline, Maquoketa, Iowa, to the Pacific or bust, and he made it too. Nigg pushed the wheelbarrow to the West Coast as the result of an election bet. Charles continued his wheelbarrow trips in later years, taking time out to serve in World War I. He financed himself by giving talks, selling souvenirs, and writing books. Charles served in the Spanish-American War and was an engineer on an ocean liner, as shown in the 1930 census. He authored the book Shortcuts for Mathematics and wrote the first English Tagalog Philippine language directory. He spoke 9 languages. Charles Nigg graduated from Maquoketa with the class of 1894. Just prior to his death, the Edwardsville, Illinois paper published this on March 14, 1939. Charles Nigg, insane. Conservator authorized to pay Opal Nigg wife the sum of $10 monthly until further order of the court. He died May 4, 1939, and is buried in Danville National Cemetery in Illinois. Charles Nigg's Shortcut for Mathematics book can be viewed on display at the Maine Museum. Also on display is macrame, made by Charles while he was in the Navy. Attached is a note from his mother. Charlie made this for me when he was in the Navy in World War I. I never got any material for a runner, which it was intended for. Mother. Headline, pushes wheelbarrow 2,300 miles to pay bet. The takeoff to the Pacific coast received a much larger send-off than Charles Lindbergh's Long Island takeoff for Paris, judging by this picture. Men in the front now bearing trumpets and tubas and lettering on the drum indicates that the Maquoketa concert band provided march music. The billiard sign, I don't know if you can see that on the left, might have been the Main Street location of Rio's cigar store or its predecessor. The article states, last November, Nigg made a wager that Woodrow Wilson would receive 450 electoral votes. The loser of the wager was to leave Maquoketa bareheaded with 1 day's rations, pushing a wheelbarrow, and tramp to the Pacific coast. Nigg was the loser. He reached Victorville last Friday night and left early Saturday morning and should reach his destination, Long Beach, by tonight. He arrived in Los Angeles March 11th, making the 2,277-mile walk in just 112 days. Relatives donated his wheelbarrow to the museum. Letter, postcards, and newspaper clippings tell of the pleasures, hardships, and experiences of his long journey. Nigg wrote from Baghdad, California on March 3rd, made 26 miles yesterday and 35 today. If the roads and desert do not get worse, then the 92 miles I have traveled will be out of the desert in 2 or 3 days. Gold Road, Arizona, February 25th. Stayed at Kingman 3 days, waiting for weather to clear up and to fix the barrow. Yesterday I traveled through an Indian reservation. The only Indian I have talked with talked Mexican. Just imagine an American of French-German extraction pushing an Irish buggy, talking to an Indian in Spanish. I am parallelly, I can say the word, the Santa Fe Railroad. They have been building a good deal of new track and also resurfacing much of the old track, so the walking is rather tough in places. The 1904 yearbook listed Charles as a teacher in Manila, Pacific Island. Charles Nigg wrote a letter to J.W. Ellis, August 1st, 1901, that appeared in the paper. He told of teaching school and how he was fairly well settled at Malolos in the Philippines. He told Mr. Ellis that he would look around for a few more relics. The latest addition to his collection was an Ilocano guitar made out of native wood and the lower half a coconut shell. He didn't send any pictures, he explained, because they were expensive. They cost 10 cents each. He said he would buy Mr. Ellis a native saw and also a ball made only from rattan that bounced like a rubber ball. The language they spoke was Tagalog, and that was the book that he had written about, which he said was very hard to learn and few Americans can speak it. He went on to say, "I have mastered it, and I can talk as fast as any of the natives." The construction of our language by the natives when speaking is almost as comical as a Punch and Judy show. They speak about 2 words in English, a couple in Spanish, and end with Tagalog. The soldiers call this kind of talking Caravan Spanish. And I wonder if that word was misspelled, because you cannot find that word, Caravan. I cannot find that. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Third born was Jessie Teresa Nigg. Jessie married Huber Augustus Young, and they lived in Davenport, and then moved to Los Angeles prior to 1935. Jessie had completed 3 years of high school and was employed as a seamstress prior to her marriage. Her husband was employed as a bookkeeper and later worked for the IRS. Their son Frank was drafted and spent 5 years in the Army. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. He was engaged to Mary, but when he went to war, she married another man. He did marry in 1943 and had children. After the war, Frank was employed in research. His brother John became a film editor. Jessie's younger brother was Frank Carl Nigg. Photo on left, taken at Cundall's studio. Find a grave lists Frank as being buried in Mount Hope, which, he's not. He was lost at sea. And I couldn't find a picture of the marker, but there is supposed to be a marker there. Frank also served on the U.S.S. Iowa. The U.S.S. Iowa may refer to several vessels, including the U.S.S. Iowa BB-4, shown in the photo. It was in place in limited commission April 28, 1917. After serving as a receiving ship at Philadelphia for 6 months, she was sent to Hampton Roads and remained there for the duration of the war, training men for other ships of the fleet and doing guard duty at the entrance of Chesapeake Bay. She was decommissioned for the final time on March 31st, 1919. It is believed that Frank Nigg may have trained on the U.S.S. Iowa, thus explaining his having a Navy cap and the U.S.S. Iowa on its band. And shown here are his cap and uniform. And if you get a chance at the end, come up and take a look at that. And otherwise they're housed at the main museum. But it's totally stitched by hand. So I'm just amazed at the uniformity of all of the stitches on that uniform. Frank Carl Nigg graduated from MHS. Other class members in Frank's graduating class of 1899 were Winfield Tubbs, Pearl Battles, who moved to Washington, D.C., Bertha Harrington Organ, Harris W. Penrose, Hugo Stack, Charles Anderson, and Walter L. Keck. Frank would have also known Henry Mitchell, who graduated with the class of 1898, and Arch and Arthur Hamlin, who graduated in 1900. So Walter L. Keck was your grandfather. The youngest child of William and Henrietta was Will Nigg. Will graduated from MHS and was a classmate of Frank Banghart. Newspaper account after the death of Will Nigg. William Nigg was the second son whom Mrs. Conrad Nigg, 1104 Colorado Court, Davenport, had given to her country, given in the full sense of the word. For his name appears in the casualty list today as a victim of pneumonia in France. He died October 3rd. Lieutenant F.C. Nigg, the other son, was lost on the steamer Cyclops. A third son is in the Naval Service. So I also have on display from the main museum. On the right you see a black band, and that was a mourning band that was worn by Henrietta Nigg. And then the Gold Star flag clock that you see would have been hung in her window during the mourning period. Will's military registration card shown. Will was of medium height and medium build, with gray eyes and dark brown hair. He is listed as single at the time of enlistment, but I found information that he may have had a wife named Emma. Will Nigg departed for France August 17, 1918, with Company C, 313th Ammunition Train. He died of pneumonia at Base Hospital No. 30 in France. He is buried in an American cemetery near Clermont-Ferrand, France. Cyclops' rumor proves untrue. A tiny ray of hope that her son might still be among the living was dispelled Monday for Mrs. Nigg of Davenport, when a report came from Berlin stating that the German naval officers doubted the arrival of the U.S. Navy collier Cyclops into a German port. When stories were published that the Cyclops had been brought into a German port, Mrs. Nigg immediately communicated with the Navy Department and was informed that there was no truth in such reports. The naval officers in Berlin stated that there would be much difficulty in landing the collier in a German port on account of the strict blockade maintained by the Americans ever since the armistice. Frank was a junior lieutenant in the U.S. Navy and was on board the Cyclops as a passenger. It is surmised that he was traveling to the United States from Europe to get his commission of senior lieutenant. So that, makes the tragedy even sadder, Shown is the Nigg family from left to right. Will, father, Frank, Jesse, Louis, mother, and Charles on the far right. And that photo can be viewed at the museum as well. U.S.S. Cyclops, one of the Navy's greatest mysteries, the ship that fell off the face of the earth. Many books have been written about the ship. Shown are two by author Marvin W. Barrick. U.S.S. Cyclops departs Barbados, vanishes in Bermuda Triangle. All 306 aboard lost without a trace. Another pivotal moment in the Cyclops' operational history was its involvement in the United States occupation of Veracruz in 1914. This intervention was part of the U.S. response to the Tampico Affair and was aimed at asserting American influence in Mexico during a time of political instability. Photos shown the U.S.S. Cyclops under construction in 1910, U.S. Library of Congress. The fact that the collier had been missing nearly a month became known here April 11th, the Des Moines Register reported, on April 15th, 1918. The naval censor requested the Associated Press not to publish the fact on ground that the ship had not been given up for lost, and that to publish the fact that she was overdue might expose her to enemy attack, while she might be disabled on the high seas. As the search continued, additional information trickled out to the public. Shown is the intended route of the collier in broken blue lines, which I guess, so they're broken blue because you can't really see the colors from there, here. That was the intended route. And then the actual route taken here. And then the last part is showing what they suspected then the rest of the route was after leaving Barbados. Investigations by the Office of Naval Intelligence revealed that Captain Worley was born Johann Friedrich Whitman in Sandstedt, Hanover, Germany, and that he entered North America by jumping ship in San Francisco. He changed his name to Worley and operated a saloon in San Francisco's Barbary Coast. He last commanded several civilian merchant ships, picking up and delivering cargo, both legal and illegal. Some say opium. From the Far East to San Francisco, crews on these ships reported Worley suffered from a personality disorder and brutalized his crew over trivial things. He was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve, February 21, 1917. Naval investigators discovered he would berate and curse officers and men for minor offenses, sometimes to the point of violence. Sometimes he would make rounds dressed in long underwear and a derby hat. He allowed an inexperienced officer to take charge of loading the manganese ore, something a collier was not used to carrying. And in this instant, the ship may have been overloaded, which may have contributed to her sinking. Accusations were made against Worley that he was pro-German in wartime and may have colluded with the enemy, as his closest friends were German or Americans of German descent. The Cyclops had 3 sister ships, all commissioned in 1913, which were all ill-fated. U.S.S. Proteus and U.S.S. Nereus were both lost at sea in 1941. Each was carrying a load of bauxite, ore, used for making aluminum. Both were lost without a trace. One probably near the Caribbean Sea, and the other after departing the Virgin Islands. The U.S.S. Jupiter was later commissioned as the U.S.S. Langley and was attacked by Japanese aircraft and hit by 5 bombs, causing critical damage. Some crew members were rescued. New York Times reported April 15, 1918, no well-founded reason can be given to explain the Cyclops being overdue, as no radio communication with or trace of her has been had since leaving the West Indian port. The weather in the area in which the vessel must have passed has not been bad, and should hardly have given the Cyclops trouble. While a raider or submarine could be responsible for her loss, there have been no reports that would indicate the presence of either in the locality in which the Cyclops was. It was known that one of the 2 engines of the Cyclops was injured, and that she was proceeding at a reduced speed with 1 engine compounded. This fact would have had no effect on her ability to communicate by radio. So even if both engines were totally disabled, the radio still would have functioned. The search for the Cyclops still continues, but the Navy Department feels extremely anxious as to her safety. More newspaper headlines from New York Times and the Washington Post are shown. More ships hunt for missing Cyclops. Fate of ship baffles. The Washington Post headline, Collier Cyclops is lost. 293 persons on board. Enemy blow suspected. Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette reported 3 Iowa boys are listed among those on board the naval collier Cyclops, which it was announced today has been missing since March 13. One of the passengers on the final voyage was Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the Consul General in Rio de Janeiro, who was as roundly hated for his pro-German sympathies as was Worley, the ship's captain. Some believe Gottschalk may have been directly involved in collaborating with Worley on handing the ship over to the Germans. After World War I, German records were checked to ascertain the fate of the Cyclops, whether by Worley's hand or by submarine attack, and nothing was found. Publication of a dispatch from San Francisco quoting Mrs. A.M. Angerman, a sister of Worley, as saying their family name was Whitman, and that her brother was born in Germany and came to this country as a child. This led to the examination of the commander's record at the Navy Department. Haven't Given Up Hope, printed the New York Times on April 17th. April 18th, Norfolk, Virginia. Mrs. Selma W. Worley, and so she is the captain's wife, declared today that she is thoroughly convinced that the Cyclops is safe and will be heard from within a few days. She denied that she received word from any source as to the fate of the vessel. Mrs. Worley characterized as ridiculous and absurd the theory that Captain Worley had sailed the Cyclops off her course and turned her over to a German raider. She says she is confident that the ship is adrift at sea and with engines disabled or she is short of coal. A letter received from her husband shortly before sailing said the starboard engine was out of commission, and she believes the port engine was broken down under the increased strain imposed upon it. Although born in Germany, Captain Worley yielded to no one in his loyalty to the United States, his wife declared. Mrs. Worley, in a statement issued, declared that the mystery surrounding the disappearance of the collier would be cleared up within the next 24 hours. In one statement, she is alleged to have said that the Cyclops is safe in a South American port, and that an official announcement would be forthcoming. Mrs. Worley is known to have visited the homes of the families who have members and relatives on the ship and told them not to be worried anymore. Oops, that just seems so cruel, what she did. Steamer met gale. It was speculated she went down due to weather conditions. A map prepared by the U.S. Weather Bureau and published in June 1929, issue of the popular Science Monthly, showing weather conditions at the time the Cyclops was lost. And so they're saying that, really, the weather was not bad. The Navy Department officially gave up the U.S.S. Cyclops as lost on April 13, 1918. However, the ship was not officially stricken from the Navy list until June 14 of 1918. Also on that date, all 309 persons who were on board the ship were declared as deceased. That included the Cyclops crew, Navy passengers, the U.S. Consul General at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, who was also a passenger, and 5 prisoners. So I think the fact that 5 prisoners may have been why the count, was always wrong before. Part of the reason. Near the time of the search for the Cyclops, it called off, a telegram was received by the State Department from Charles Ledlow Livingston, and he was the U.S. Consul on Barbados, and he sent this to the Secretary of State. Confidential. Master Cyclops stated that required 600 tons of coal, having sufficient on board to reach Bermuda. Engines, very poor condition. Not sufficient funds, and therefore request payment by me. Usually reticent. I have ascertained he took here ton fresh meat. I wonder, how did they preserve that? Ton flour, 1,000 pounds of vegetables, paying therefore $775. From different sources, gather the following. He had plenty of coal. Alleged inferior, took coal to mix, probably had more than 1,500 tons. Master alluded to by others as damned Dutchman, apparently disliked by other officers. Rumored disturbances en route hither, men confined and 1 executed. Also had some prisoners from the fleet in Brazilian waters. 1 life sentence. United States Consul General Gottschalk passenger. 231 crew, exclusive of officers and passengers, have names of crew but not all of the officers and passengers. Many Germanic names appear. Number telegraphic or wireless messages addressed to master or in care of ship were delivered at this port. All telegrams from Barbados on file at the head office in St. Thomas. I have to suggest scrutiny there. While not having definite grounds, I fear a fate worse. 1929, Popular Science Monthly theorized, out of the maze of letters, wireless communication, and intercepted German message, one solution appeared. It is that the collier was caught in a terrific storm south of the Virginia Capes, capsized and sunk with all hands. St. Petersburg's time, February 14, 1929. Navy believes Cyclops' fate is cleared up. They cite the following evidence. On its fatal voyage, the Cyclops was not directly operating in the naval service, but had been chartered by the U.S. and Brazil Steamship Company to transport manganese. The naval vessel was overloaded in excess of its maximum dead weight. At the time of its last sailing, there were 4,000 tons of seawater, mostly in the collier's double bottom. The crew were mainly inexperienced. Southeast Missourian, 1930. There were disjointed extracts from a diary of a man who was supposed to have claimed partial credit for the disappearance. It said men were paid by an unnamed person to place an explosive in the hold of the Cyclops, set for explosion after the ship cleared the Barbados for the Maryland port. Shortly before the explosion, the writer of the diary and one companion were said to have embarked in a boat and picked up by a steamer hovering nearby. 1939, last war's unsolved mystery. She was the pride of the Navy. She was heavily armored, high-powered, and streamlined for speed, yet capable of carrying 12,300 tons of cargo. Those were the days of coal, and the Cyclops' function was to refuel the battleships while they traveled at half speed, thus giving them an enlarged range of action. The maneuver was effected by steel derricks attached to a superstructure 40 feet above the main deck, while steel cabbies from the reinforced boom supports carriers holding the coal. She was a super collier, and at that time the answer to an admiral's prayer. On March 12th, the Cyclops radioed the U.S. Navy Department that she had engine trouble and would be late in reaching port. That was the last time she was ever heard from. 1942, Today's Strange Story by Vance Wynn. Her cargo was manganese from Brazil. This grayish-white metallic element is largely used in the manufacture of glass and paint, and would have been particularly useful to the U.S. and allied nations at that time. That fact caused most officials of the government to conclude the Cyclops had become a victim of a German submarine or bomb placed in its cargo before leaving Brazil. Another theory was an explosion, for which there is no evidence. Some of the best authorities among naval men believe it went down in a tropical storm. 1973, the Navy says it will reopen a 55-year-old search for the mystery ship Cyclops, acting on information of a retired diver who believes he stumbled upon the sunken vessel in 1969. The Navy said on Thursday that a search would be launched in hopes of solving the service's most baffling riddle. The search effort will send the salvage ship Kittiwake to a point about 70 miles off the Virginia Capes. Has the Cyclops been found? No, this turned out to be false. In 1918, a report by the Secretary of Navy Daniels intimated that probably not until the sea gives up its secrets would the fate of the Cyclops be known. The fact that she was modern, staunch, well-manned and equipped makes the disappearance of the collier inexplicable. Many theories have been advanced, but none that account for her disappearance. This was written before two of Cyclops' sister ships vanished at sea during World War II, less than a year after their sale to civilian operators. Both ships were transporting heavy loads of metallic ore. I guess I did mention that before. And in both cases, their loss was theorized to have been the result of catastrophic structural failure or attributed to the Bermuda Triangle. One officer who had gotten off the ship blamed this tragedy on a captain who created a thoroughly demoralized and disorganized crew because of his irrational methods of command. He believes the ship split down the middle and quickly sank. Other theories speculate the ship was sunk by a German U-boat, but there was no indication of that. The Cyclops departed Brazil and was on the open waters for 2 weeks with no issue. As it entered the Bermuda Triangle, and I don't know, for some reason I can't seem to scroll. Oh, there we go. That's my place. The Cyclops departed Brazil and was on the open water for 2 weeks with no issues. As it entered the Bermuda Triangle, it was pulled deeper into the water and toward the ledge of the Puerto Rico Trench waterfall at an accelerating rate. The ship's captain mistakenly believed the boat was overloaded. The plimsoll line, a measurement on the ship's hull, indicated that the ship was sitting deeper in the water than it should have been. So he radioed to a port in Barbados, who agreed to receive him. In making the detour, he began moving away from the trench's mouth. And so as they approached Barbados, the strength of the downward forces had decreased, and the ship was more buoyant. And by the time they reached the Barbados port, the plimsoll line was right where it needed to be. So then the captain, wasn't concerned about that. The plimsoll line, since it was at the right levels, he requested more coal and water, which he was provided. He wanted that extra power in case that happened again. And as he departed Barbados, resuming his journey towards Baltimore, he once again charged into those deceptively mild waters of the Bermuda Triangle. And once again, that plimsoll line sunk lower, and the waters became like quicksand near the trench's mouth. Ultimately, the ship and crew were swallowed up by the sea. Upside Chronicles 2021. This theory addresses why we can't find them and where they all are. The legend of the Bermuda Triangle has long intrigued humanity. The enigmatic region is famed for numerous disappearances of planes and vessels. Perhaps one of the most perplexing aspects surrounding the region is that many of those lost in the Devil's Triangle, they're never recovered. It's as though they vanished into thin air. Leading theories include rogue tidal waves, aliens, foreign interference, methane reserves, and even the lost city of Atlantis. Upside took a deep dive into the history and geographical features of the region. They pieced together a theory based on real-world physics that addresses not only why the area waters are deceptively calm and where all the missing ships are, which I just mentioned, in the last slide. There were 7 Iowans who were lost at sea when the Cyclops vanished. Unidentified crew members shown in this photo. William Otis Bees, seaman, 2nd class, was born in Lisbon, Iowa, February 19, 1894. He enlisted, Des Moines, July 10, 1917. Married 4 years earlier in Marion, Iowa, he left behind his wife, Anna Runkle Bees. Source, Evening Times Republican, Marshalltown, Iowa. John Brawford, one of Esterville's young soldiers, was on the Collier Cyclops, which is missing, and his many friends and relatives are very much concerned about his safety. John William Brawford, yeoman, 2nd class, was born March 12, 1896, in Esterville. He enlisted, Des Moines, May 5, 1917. He had 6 siblings. 2 died young and preceded him in death. He was the son of John S. and Mary Peck Crawford. Fred Davison. I've also seen the name spelled with a D in Davison as well. From Coyne, Iowa, fireman, second class, was born December 16, 1886. He enlisted in Kansas City, July 2, 1917. He left behind a wife, Mahala Peyton Davison, and 3 children. Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank Carl Nigg from Maquoketa, Iowa, was born in 1882. He was appointed from Iowa. And since the U.S.S. Cyclops was never found, as I mentioned before, he is not buried at Mount Hope. But supposedly there is a marker there. Fred Henry Rooney served as an electrician, first class. He was a passenger on board from Council Bluffs, Iowa. He was born in 1889 in Dubuque, the oldest child of 4, son of Michael and Jeanette Howard Rooney. He enlisted San Diego, California, March 7, 1915. Thomas Watkins, fireman, second class from Melcher, Iowa, was born in 1888. He enlisted St. Louis, May 29, 1917. Evening Times Republican, Marshalltown, Iowa. Worth Wymore of Montezuma enlisted in the United States Navy about a year ago and was one of the crew of the naval collier Cyclops that has been long overdue at an American port. Worth Wymore, carpenter's mate from Montezuma, was born January 13, 1894. He enlisted Des Moines, May 31, 1917. Worth was the oldest of 6 children born to Samuel and Elsie Mae McMains Wymore. Picture of Nigg's memorial found in the research library. So I'm not sure where this actually is, or if this was maybe when they had the funeral for him. Over 100 years later, the disappearance of the U.S.S. Cyclops remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone want to share what they think happened to the Cyclops? I mean, I presented all the theories, but I think that last one, you know, with that trench, I mean, that makes sense that it just pulled them in, but we'll never know, I guess. Till the ship. All named after women? So anyway, it's just, like I said, I found this out by accident because I was researching for the deaths of 1918. But anyway, if you get a chance here to come up and view the artifacts, and otherwise later they'll go back to the main museum. And look at this, I finished 5 minutes before. That's not